this is my attempt to try and get you to maybe potentially change the way you think about constructing your introduction to help you write it a little bit more clearly. And so this is kind of a typical funnel plot which you often get told about when you're trying to write. And so the idea being that as you write an introduction section for a piece of work, that initially you write sort of broader topic stuff, so you just highlight the kind of the area as a whole, and then bit by bit as you go through paragraph to paragraph you start to narrow the focus until you get to the real specifics of the question, and then finally your rationale and hypothesis or aims. Now often when we try and write this, we start at the top. We start by highlighting the broader topic. So for you guys it might be explaining the nature of the disease and maybe why it's important. Now that absolutely should be at the top of the piece of work, but it's not always the best to start there. So what I would advise you to do is really start focusing on this area that I've highlighted in red. So really thinking about the specifics of the piece of work that you're looking to do. So you need to do lots of reading around the area. So that would be, if you're looking at say COPD, you'd be looking universally at COPD papers that have looked at exercise variables and maybe specifically the exercise variables that you think you're interested in. So you're really reading about the specifics of the area, and then from that reading you need to draw out a rationale. So like, why are you doing the study? So again, I said this quite a lot before in the past, that the most important part of an introduction is the rationale, why you're doing the study. The rest of the information, so highlighting the broader topic and then narrowing it further, that is there to support the production of that rationale. So it's easier, it's harder because it's harder to think about, but it'll be easier in the long term if you really focus on nailing that first and knowing, yeah, I've got a good reason for doing this study. So it might well be that, let's say, VO2 peak has been shown to reduce in patients with COPD. However, more recently, literature has indicated that, say, VEV-CO2 is also a useful marker, and so we are going to do a case control study to see, which one is the most, something like that. But it could be anything. But you have to come to that point where there's a reason for doing the study, and the reason should be, well, there are 3 different types of rationale, and they differ in terms of their strength. So a really strong rationale would have like real world implications that are really important, and also that the fact that there's no literature that has been done in that area before. So a really topical example of that would be, coronavirus is, a global pandemic, so it's really important, everyone's interested in it, but also no one studied the effect of this particular treatment on reducing symptoms or treating the disease. So that ticks both of those boxes. Really important in the real world, and also never been studied. Now, you're not going to have a really strong rationale for this work because we know that there's a fair bit of work that's been done on all of these diseases and how exercise variables change when you have the disease. So what you're looking for is still you need to produce a rationale, but it's likely to be weaker. So 2 examples of maybe weaker rationales might be, well, maybe there's conflict in the literature, so maybe that's a step down. So rather than just being brand new, maybe some previous studies have looked at what you're looking at, but maybe there's conflict in terms of some papers are showing one thing, some papers are showing another. So the rationale for your study is that you're going to study it to try and sort of understand more about, the direction of movement for this particular variable. So let's say it was for VEV-CO2 again. Let's say some studies have shown that it was a really important marker in COPD, some have shown that it wasn't, so you're going to do another study to try and understand more about whether that's the case. And then lower down than that, a weaker rationale still would be, well, this has been done, we know this exists, but I'm going to study it further to try and further understand that area. So that would be not even that there's conflicts, it might just be that we know VO2 peak is low in people with COPD. However, we are going to study we are going to further study the impact of this on whatever. Now just know that bottom rationale is incredibly weak. It's weak that you wouldn't get it published if you were trying to publish it in an article, but we're at second year undergraduate, and so I'd prefer you to have a weak rationale like that than no rationale at all. Ideally your rationale will be the level up, so maybe identifying conflicts or maybe some subtle differences that are not quite shown in the literature that you can focus on, but If you can't find any of them, at least make the rationale that you understand the area, you know that this has been shown largely before, but you're going to further study it. That's the important bit. And then once you've got that, then you can work up and start to think about how you're going to populate each paragraph above that. So for example, if you're going to look at VEVCO2 primarily, and that's your rationale, well then the summarizing previous studies, that paragraph above will need to focus on, you know, how VEVCO2 differs or doesn't differ in participants with COPD. So you kind of can write an outline of that summarized previous studies paragraph, because it has to be there in order for your rationale to make sense. Then you can go a step further than that, because then you could go up to, well, if I wanted to talk about VEVCO2 in COPD, well then what does the previous paragraph need to look like? And it's probably going to need to include some information about how, say, COPD influences markers of exercise capacity and aerobic capacity. Something like that, like tying COPD, some sort of exercise variables together. And then you can take it further than that. Say, well, if someone needs to understand how COPD influences these exercise variables, then they're going to also need to know what COPD is. So maybe the paragraph above that is highlighting the broader topic would be an explanation about what COPD is. And you might even have one between highlighting the broader topic and narrowing the topic, which is an explanation about what kind of aerobic capacity is and how it changes, because that might then naturally lead on to combining those two things together. So if you started off with highlighting the broader topic, COPD, a paragraph underneath it about highlighting, you know, how we can measure aerobic capacity using things like VO2 peak and stuff like that, and then you can combine them together to start talking about how, you know, COPD influences those exercise variables. But starting off with that idea and starting off at this point will be much more beneficial than starting at the top and thinking that you're going to work down to a nice clear rationale. It doesn't tend to work like that. You end up getting distracted by different things that you read, which send you in different directions. So you want to focus all your time, if you're just starting this bit, on finding this rationale, summarizing the previous studies, and then working back to the other paragraphs. And what that will also do is, if you know your rationale, that's also going to tell you, you know, I'll give you an indication about what variables you're going to look at, which is going to influence your methods and your results. And it's also going to be the core element of what your discussion is, because your discussion is going to reflect whatever rationale and topic area that you set up there. So that is the most important bit where you should spend your time if you're not already.